The phone rang at 2 in the morning, and Clara heard it. She was not supposed to hear it. She was 17 years old, and her bedroom was at the end of the hall, and her father always spoke quietly when he thought the house was asleep. But the walls in their apartment were thin, and silence at 2 in the morning has a way of carrying sound further than walls should allow. She lay still under her blanket and listened to her father's voice move through the darkness like smoke under a door. She could not make out words, only the tone, and the tone was wrong. It was not the voice her father used when he spoke to his business contacts, that careful, practiced warmth he put on like a coat when money was involved. It was not the voice he used with her mother, which was tired in the comfortable way that long marriages allow. This was something else. This was the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he could not see the bottom of, and still choosing to lean forward. She did not know that yet. She only knew the tone was wrong, and that it stayed with her all the way into a sleep she did not fully reach. Her name was Clara. Her older sister's name was Diane. Diane was 22, and studying nursing at a college 40 minutes away by bus, and she came home on weekends with laundry and a loud, easy laugh that filled whatever room she walked into. Their father, Jeffrey, ran a small importing business from a rented office downtown. Their mother, Lorraine, managed the family with the quiet precision of someone who had long ago decided that keeping things together was more important than anyone knowing she was the one doing it. They lived in a mid-sized city in the north of England, in a flat that was always almost warm enough, on a street where people minded their business, because minding your business was a form of survival everyone had quietly agreed upon. It was not a bad life. It was not a remarkable life. It was the kind of life that looks, from the outside, exactly like stability. What it looked like from the inside depended entirely on which room you were standing in. Jeffrey Harlow had borrowed money 18 months before the phone call. Not from a bank. Banks had turned him down twice, the second time with a letter so politely worded it had almost been insulting. He had borrowed from a man named Victor Crane. Nobody in their neighborhood called Victor Crane by his name. They called him other things, quieter things, or they did not call him anything at all, which was its own kind of name. He had come up through a layer of the city that most people preferred not to think about, the layer beneath the one you could see, the one that kept itself running on arrangements and understandings that were never written down and never needed to be. Victor Crane was 61 years old. He had a house in a good part of the city, a car that was expensive without being loud about it, and a reputation that had been building for 30 years like water finding its level. He did not need to threaten people often. The fact of him was threat enough. Jeffrey had gone to him because he had run out of other options, and because a man named Dennis who drank at the same pub had told him Victor was reasonable, that the terms were manageable, that plenty of people had borrowed and paid back without incident. What Dennis had not told him, or perhaps had not known, was that Victor's version of reasonable terms had a very specific window, and that window had a way of closing faster than people expected. The money was meant to cover a shortfall in a shipment of imported goods that Jeffrey had staked more than he should have on. The shipment arrived late. The buyer pulled out. The money was already spent. The debt was not. For 18 months, Jeffrey had been managing the payments the way a man manages a leak in a ceiling, patching it, delaying it, telling himself the roof was not actually failing, that he would get ahead of it soon. He had told Lorraine a version of things that was technically true in some of its details, and deeply false in all of its implications. He had told the girls nothing. What he told Victor Crane on the phone at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, Clara would only learn in pieces, over years, some of it told to her directly, and some of it assembled from things her father said in moments he did not realize he was being honest. What she came to understand was this. Her father had offered something in exchange for more time. He had been on the phone for 23 minutes. He had offered something that was not his to offer, and the name he had spoken, quietly, into the receiver while his daughter lay awake at the end of the hall, was Diane's. The details of what was proposed, Clara could never bring herself to lay out in full, even to herself. It was enough to understand the shape of it, that Jeffrey Harlow, her father, the man who had driven her to school and told her bedtime stories and fixed her bicycle chain twice in a car park in the rain, had looked at a debt he could not pay and decided that one of his daughters was a currency he could use. Whether he believed Victor would say no, Whether he told himself it was a desperate bluff and not a genuine offer, whether he had convinced himself that it was the kind of thing people proposed and never meant, Clara had turned over and over and never fully answered. Because the answer did not change what he had said, and what he had said had left the phone and traveled through the dark city to another man's ear, and that man had not said no. Lorraine knew nothing of this. She slept 8 feet away from the man who had just made that call, her breathing even, her face calm in the way that sleeping faces are always calm, withholding nothing and revealing nothing, simply resting. Clara had fallen into a thin sleep by 3 in the morning. She woke at 6:15 to the alarm, made toast, spoke to her mother about something ordinary, said goodbye, and went to school. On the bus, she watched the city move past the window and thought about the voice she had heard through the wall, the one that had been wrong in a way she could not name. She did not know yet that by the following Thursday, a man would be sitting in her father's chair in their living room, and everything in the flat would feel slightly rearranged, as though the furniture had been moved an inch in every direction overnight, and no one could prove it but everyone could feel it. She did not know that the next time she heard Diane's name spoken in that flat, it would be by a man she had never met, and it would land in the room like something dropped from a height. She did not know that the thing she had been born with, the reflex in her that pushed forward when everything else pulled back, was about to be the most important thing about her. She went to school, she took notes, she ate lunch with her friend Katie by the window in the canteen. She came home. And for 6 more days, everything looked exactly like what it had always been. Jeffrey Harlow was a careful man in most respects. He paid his utility bills on the exact due date, not early, and never late. He kept the car clean. He did not gamble, did not drink to excess, did not raise his voice at the dinner table. He was the kind of man who believed that the appearance of order was close enough to order that the difference could be ignored. He had lived that way for most of his life, and it had worked. Mostly, the way most things work when the wrong pressure has not yet been applied. The wrong pressure was now being applied. In the 6 days between the phone call and the Thursday that would change everything, Clara watched her father without knowing she was watching him. She noticed that he stirred his tea longer than necessary, that he sat with his back to the window when he had always sat facing it, that he laughed once at the dinner table and the laugh stopped in the middle of itself, cut off like a light going out, and he covered it with a cough. She noticed these things and filed them somewhere without a label, the way you file information your mind is not yet ready to name. Diane came home that Thursday. She had a test to study for, and she wanted the kitchen table, because the kitchen table at home was wider than the one in her room at college, and she had always studied better with space around her. She came in at 4:30, dropped her bag by the door, said something cheerful to Clara about a lecturer she found ridiculous, and went to make tea. Their father was already home. He was in the living room. He was sitting very still. Diane did not notice the stillness. Clara did, from the hallway, where she had stopped because something in the flat felt different than it had that morning. A pressure, like the moment before a change in weather, and her feet had stopped moving before her mind had told them to. The doorbell rang at 5 o'clock. The things that were about to be set into motion, the things that would determine the shape of the next several years of Clara's life, had already started before anyone in that flat was fully aware they had begun. A debt, a phone call, 6 days of watching a man stir his tea too long. This was the architecture of what was coming. The doorbell rang, and Jeffrey Harlow stood up from his chair to answer it, and Clara stood in the hallway and watched him, and for one still moment before the door opened, the flat was just a flat, and they were just a family, and nothing had happened yet. Then the door opened, and everything that had been waiting began. The 2 men who came in first did not look like what Clara had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected, because the expecting happened in the same half-second as the seeing, and there was no time between them to prepare. They were not large in the theatrical way. One was average height with close-cropped hair and an ordinary coat. The other was taller, broader, with the kind of stillness that did not belong to patience but to something more deliberate. They stepped into the hallway without being invited in. Her father stepped back to let them pass, and the stepping back was automatic, muscle memory. The body of a man who had already made an agreement his mind was still trying not to fully see. Clara pressed herself against the hallway wall. They did not look at her. The third man came in last and pulled the door shut behind him, with a quiet click that somehow carried more weight than a slam would have. Victor Crane was not what the city had described. The city, the layer of it that whispered his name, had described him in the colors of threat, in the language of size and danger, and things done in the dark. What walked into their hallway was a man of 61, with thinning gray hair combed back neatly, a good overcoat, and eyes that were not unkind, which was somehow worse than if they had been. Unkind eyes you could orient yourself against. His eyes simply measured. They moved across the hallway, took in Clara with brief, impersonal attention, and then moved past her toward the living room, and she had the feeling of being catalogued and set aside, an item noted but not yet relevant. Her father said his name, Victor. He said it the way people say the names of things they are afraid of, quietly, with a breath before and after it. Victor Crane looked at the living room and walked into it without being asked. The two men followed. Jeffrey followed, and Clara, who had not decided to follow, found that her feet had already made the decision for her. The living room was not large. The sofa, the coffee table, the armchair by the window where her father always sat with his cup of tea in the evenings. Victor Crane walked to that chair and sat down in it with an ease that suggested he had always intended to sit in it, that the chair had been waiting for him specifically. One of the men stood by the door. The other stood near the window. Jeffrey stood in the middle of the room and did not sit down, which left him standing in his own living room like a visitor, like someone who had arrived somewhere he was not sure he was welcome. Diane was in the kitchen. The kitchen was at the back of the flat. The door was half closed. Clara could hear the faint sound of the kettle having already boiled, and the silence where the sound of Diane making tea should have been, the silence of someone who has gone still because they have heard something and are not yet sure what to do with it. Victor Crane picked up the cup of tea that Jeffrey had, at some point, already placed on the coffee table. He looked at it. He set it back down. He did not speak immediately. The silence in the room was not empty. It had a quality to it, a density, as though it were itself a form of communication, the message being, I am not in a hurry, and you are, and we both know which of us that matters to. Then he spoke, and his voice was ordinary. That was what struck Clara most. It was a conversational voice, a voice you would not turn to look at on a bus, a voice that belonged to the surface of things. He spoke to Jeffrey about the debt, about the arrangement, about the terms, and Jeffrey nodded at intervals with the nods of a man trying to look as though he is participating in a conversation he has already lost. And then Victor said Diane's name. Clara heard it from where she stood in the doorway of the living room, half in and half out, and the name landed in the room like something physical, like a hand placed on a table. Just the name. The rest of what he said around it, the context, the arrangement, Clara processed afterward, in the way you process impact after the collision, when the noise has cleared and you can assess the damage. She heard Diane's name, and she looked at her father, and her father looked at the floor, and that look, that particular quality of not meeting anyone's eyes, told her everything the words had not yet finished saying. The reflex happened before thought. She stepped into the room. She was 17 years old. She was not large. She was wearing a school uniform she had not yet changed out of, gray and slightly creased from a day of sitting in classrooms, and she stepped into the room where Victor Crane sat in her father's chair, and she said, clearly, in a voice she was surprised to hear come out of her own body, no. Victor Crane looked at her. The two men looked at her. Her father looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between terror and relief. The face of a man watching someone step in front of something that was meant for him. She said it was not happening. She said Diane was not part of any arrangement. She said it in simple sentences, because she had no other tool available, because she was 17 and had nothing except her voice and the fact of being in the room, and so she used those. Victor Crane listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look away from her while she spoke, and his expression did not change. And that stillness was the most frightening thing she had encountered in her short life. More frightening than the men by the door and the window, more frightening than her father's averted eyes. The stillness of a man who has heard every kind of objection and learned not to be moved by any of them. When she stopped speaking, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Jeffrey, and his expression shifted, just slightly, in a way Clara could not fully read but could feel. It was not anger. It was closer to recalculation, the look of a man updating a set of figures in his head, moving a number from one column to another. He looked back at Clara. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Clara had time, in the half-second before she saw it, to think something strange and specific. She thought about the kettle in the kitchen, the sound of it, or rather the silence where the sound had been, and she thought about Diane behind that half-closed door. And the thought was not fully formed. It was more like a direction, like a compass finding north. The sense that her position in this room was the only thing standing between her sister and what was being arranged. Then she saw the gun. It was not large. It was not what films had prepared her for. It was a small, dull thing, held loosely in a hand that had clearly held it before, without drama, without ceremony, with the ease of a man picking up a pen. He set it on his knee, resting there, pointed at nothing specific, which was somehow more frightening than if it had been pointed somewhere. He looked at her. And then, with the same conversational, ordinary voice, he said something to her father. He said, "Your daughter has made this more complicated than it needed to be." And he said a figure, a number, a revised amount, a shorter deadline, a set of terms that had tightened like a knot pulled from two ends. He was not speaking to Clara anymore. He was speaking to Jeffrey about the debt, as though Clara's interruption had simply been a variable he had now accounted for and moved past. The gun remained on his knee. Clara did not move. She understood, without anyone telling her, that moving was the wrong thing to do. That stillness, right now, was the only form of power available to her. Her father had gone pale in a way she had not known skin could go pale, a quality of absence, as though the blood had simply decided not to be there anymore. He was nodding again, nodding at the new terms, nodding the way a drowning man nods when someone tosses a rope without mentioning the rope has knots in it. Victor Crane picked the gun up from his knee and put it back into his coat pocket in a single smooth movement, the way you might pocket a phone after checking the time. He picked up the cup of tea from the coffee table. He drank from it slowly, set it back, and stood. He looked at Clara one more time, and the look was brief and unreadable, and then he walked to the door. The man near the door opened it. The man near the window followed. Victor Crane walked out into the hallway, and out of the front door without looking back, and the door clicked shut behind him with the same quiet finality as it had when he arrived. The living room was exactly as it had been. Sofa, coffee table, armchair, the cup of tea with a slightly different angle to the handle, where Victor Crane had set it back down. Everything in place, everything different. Jeffrey Harlow sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, not on the sofa. He folded at the knees and sat on the floor of his own living room, and Clara stood in the doorway and watched him do it, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. That moment was not for words. It was for sitting on the floor, apparently. Diane appeared in the hallway behind Clara. She had been in the kitchen the whole time. She had heard everything, or most of it, or enough of it, through a half-closed door. Her face was very still. She looked at her father on the floor. She looked at Clara. She did not ask what had happened. She knew what had happened. What she did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the worst of it was over in the physical sense. That Victor Crane would not come back to this flat. That the gun would stay in his coat. That Diane would never be made to fulfill any arrangement. They did not know that yet. So the fear was still fully present, unqualified, occupying the room as completely as the furniture did. Diane put her hand on Clara's shoulder, just for a moment. Then she walked past her into the living room and sat on the sofa and looked at their father on the floor. Clara went to the kitchen. She put the kettle back on. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backs of the buildings across the alley, their windows lit yellow in the November dark, and thought about the voice she had heard through the wall 6 nights ago. The wrong tone, the 2 in the morning sound of a man leaning over an edge. She had known something was wrong. She had not known what shape it would take. Now she did. She made 3 cups of tea and carried them back to the living room. Her father was still on the floor. She set a cup beside him without a word. She gave one to Diane. She kept one. They sat in the living room with their tea and the particular silence of people who have just passed through something together and have not yet decided how to speak about it. Outside, the city carried on. Cars on the road, a dog barking somewhere 2 streets over. The ordinary world, going about its business, having no idea what had just happened in a flat on the 4th floor of a building on a street that minded its own business. Clara drank her tea. She was thinking about the moment she had stepped into the room, the moment before thought, the moment the reflex had moved her feet before her mind had caught up. She was turning it over, examining it, the way you examine something you have found in the ground, not sure yet whether it is valuable or whether it is broken. She had been afraid. She was certain of that. The fear had been real and complete and had run through her the entire time, underneath everything else, like a current under still water. She had been afraid, and she had stepped into the room anyway, and she had said no anyway, and she was sitting here now, with a cup of tea and her hands still steady. She did not think of this as bravery. She would not have used that word. Not then. She thought of it, if she thought of it as anything at all, as simple arithmetic. Someone had to step into that room. The math had been obvious. She was the one in the doorway. Her father said her name, Clara. He said it from the floor, without looking up, and his voice had something in it she had never heard from him before. Not apology exactly. Something rawer than apology. The sound of a man who has seen himself clearly, possibly for the first time, and does not like what the clarity has shown him. She did not answer him. Not yet. There were things she would eventually say to him, and things she would never say. And the arranging of that, the sorting of what could be spoken from what could not, would take longer than one November evening. That was future work. Tonight she only had capacity for the immediate. She looked at Diane. Diane was looking out the window at the lit-up November dark, holding her cup with both hands, and her face was doing something complicated that Clara did not try to read. There are expressions on people's faces that belong to them privately, that are not meant for other eyes even when other eyes can see them, and Diane's face in that moment was one of those. Clara looked away. Her father lifted the cup from the floor beside him and held it in both hands the way Diane was holding hers, as though warmth was the only thing on offer, and they had all decided to accept it. The November dark pressed against the windows. The city carried on outside, indifferent and constant. The 4 walls of the flat held them in place. Clara finished her tea. She set the cup down. She thought about the knees of the man she had just looked in the eye, and the thing that had rested on those knees for a few seconds, and the ordinary voice that had spoken around and through her, as though she were a new variable in an equation that was already solved. She thought about the fact that she had been in the room anyway, that she had made herself a variable. She thought about what that meant, for what was coming. Because she understood, sitting in that flat with her tea and her father on the floor and her sister looking at the window, that what had just happened was not an ending. The debt was still there. The terms had changed, but the debt had not disappeared. Victor Crane had walked out the door, but he had not walked out of their lives. This was not the end of anything. It was, she understood with a clarity that felt older than 17 years, only the end of the beginning. The morning after did not look like the morning after anything. That was what Clara noticed first, standing in the kitchen at 7:15, while the toast browned and the radio played something she was not listening to. The flat looked exactly as it had every other morning. The same chip in the tile above the sink, the same rectangle of gray November light coming through the window over the back alley, the same sound of the pipes in the walls, doing what the pipes in the walls had always done. Only the feeling was different. The feeling was like the atmosphere after lightning, when the air is changed and the light is strange, and everything is the same shape it was before, but nothing is quite the same thing. Her father did not come to breakfast. Lorraine, who had slept through everything, who had come home from her sister's at 9 the previous evening, and found the flat quiet, and assumed the quiet was ordinary, moved around the kitchen with her usual careful efficiency, and asked Clara whether she wanted the last of the marmalade, and Clara said yes. And they sat together at the kitchen table and had breakfast, and Lorraine talked about her sister's new sofa, and Clara said the right things at the right moments, and the whole performance was so ordinary that it made her chest ache. She had not told her mother. That decision had been made without discussion, without even a conversation between her and Diane. It had simply been obvious, the way some decisions are, in the same way that stepping into the living room the night before had been obvious. Lorraine lived in the flat, but she did not live in the version of the flat where those two men had stood by the door and the window, where Jeffrey had sat on the floor, where a quiet man in a good coat had set something on his knee and picked it up again. That version of the flat existed in a layer just beneath the one Lorraine could see, and for now, it needed to stay there. Jeffrey came out of the bedroom at 8:30, after Lorraine had left for work. He was dressed. He had shaved. He looked like a man who had decided that the correct response to the previous evening was to appear as normal as possible, which was, Clara thought, the most Jeffrey Harlow response to anything that she could imagine. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of tea from what was left in the pot. He stood at the counter with his back to her. He said, "I am going to fix this." Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with her school bag on her shoulder, ready to leave. She looked at the back of his head, the careful gray hair, the good posture he had always maintained, the posture of a man who believed that how you held yourself said something about who you were. She said, "I know you will." She did not know whether she believed it. She said it because there was no useful alternative, and because she was about to walk out the door and get on a bus and go to school, which was where 17-year-olds went on Tuesday mornings regardless of what had happened in their living rooms on Monday nights. She went to school. She sat in class. She wrote notes she would not remember writing. At lunch, she sat with her friend Katie by the window, and Katie talked about a boy in their chemistry class with the easy, animated energy of someone to whom the previous evening had been completely ordinary, someone whose father had probably sat in his own chair and watched something on television, and Clara listened and smiled and said the right things, and the whole time some part of her was still standing in that living room doorway, replaying the sound of the room when Victor Crane said Diane's name. What Jeffrey did in the days that followed, he did without telling anyone. Clara pieced it together afterward, from things she observed and things he eventually said, and things she was told by people at the edges of the story. He contacted men he knew, men from the layer of his life that sat just below the respectable surface, men who knew other men, and through a chain of conversations that left no paper trail, he arranged to meet someone who had once done business with Victor Crane. Not someone powerful, someone peripheral, a man named Owen who had borrowed from Victor years ago and paid in full, and considered himself, perhaps naively, on something like neutral terms with that world. Owen told Jeffrey two things. The first was that Victor Crane's terms could be renegotiated, but only if you came with something real, something concrete, a genuine partial payment that signaled seriousness, rather than another round of promises. The second was that Victor had mentioned Clara. Not in a threatening way, Owen said. That was what made it strange. He had mentioned her in passing, almost as an observation. He had said she was the most interesting thing to happen in a debt collection in a long time. Owen had not been sure whether that was good or bad, and had not asked for clarification, because you did not ask Victor Crane to clarify things. Jeffrey told Clara this on a Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while Lorraine was out. He told her with his eyes on the table, in the manner of a man delivering information he is not entirely sure how to deliver. He said Victor had noticed her. He said it with something complicated in his voice, something between warning and a kind of reluctant pride, and Clara sat with it and did not say anything for a while. Then she asked how much they needed to pay and what they had available, and the conversation shifted into the practical, which was, she was discovering, where she preferred to be. Practical things could be acted upon. The other things, the feelings she had packed into a box and set on a high shelf in the back of her mind, those she would deal with later, when there was time, when the immediate emergency had resolved. Diane, meanwhile, had gone back to college. This had not been discussed between the three of them as a decision. It had simply happened, in the way that the decision not to tell Lorraine had simply happened. On the Wednesday morning after the Monday night, Diane had packed her bag and stood at the front door and looked at Clara with an expression that contained things neither of them had language for yet. And Clara had said, "Go," and Diane had gone. She called Clara on Thursday, not to talk about what had happened. She called to ask if Clara had remembered to take her vitamin tablets, which was a thing Diane asked sometimes because Clara was terrible at taking vitamin tablets, and Diane had decided this was her responsibility to monitor. The ordinariness of the question was deliberate, Clara understood. It was Diane saying, in the only way available over a phone, "I am okay, and you are allowed to be okay too." Clara said she had remembered the vitamins. She had not. The money took 3 weeks to pull together. Jeffrey sold things. Quietly. The kind of things that can be sold without requiring explanation. A set of tools. Some equipment from the storage unit behind the office. He spoke to a cousin in Manchester who lent him a sum without asking for the reason, which was either generosity or wisdom, or both. He cashed in a small savings bond that had been sitting untouched for 11 years. It was not everything Victor Crane was owed. It was enough to be serious. Owen arranged the meeting. It took place in a pub in a part of the city that was neither Victor's territory nor Jeffrey's, which was itself a form of message. Victor came with one man instead of two, which Owen had said was a good sign, though he had not explained the reasoning. Jeffrey went alone. He had not told Clara he was going, but she had known, the way she had begun to know things about her father that she had not known 3 weeks ago. The shape of his worry had become legible to her, like a language she had not studied but had somehow started to understand. He came home at 9:30. He looked like a man who had put down something very heavy, and was not yet sure whether he was allowed to straighten up. He sat at the kitchen table and told Clara, who was waiting, that Victor Crane had accepted the partial payment and extended the deadline, that the terms were hard but survivable, that they had 8 months. 8 months. Clara looked at her father and did the math in her head, the kind of math she had not expected to be doing at 17, the kind that involved working backwards from a figure and forwards from a current state, and finding the narrow corridor between them where survival might be possible. She said, "We will need to change some things." Jeffrey said, "I know." He looked, for the first time since she had watched him sit down on the floor of his own living room, like a man who was actually present in the room he was sitting in, not managing the appearance of presence, actually there. She did not tell him she forgave him. That was not a thing she was ready for, and she did not pretend to be. But something had shifted, incrementally, in the way she looked at him, some small degree of rotation in her understanding of who he was. Not toward excuse, toward complexity. The understanding that a person could contain, at the same time, the father who drove her to school in the rain, and the man who had made a phone call at 2 in the morning, and that both things were real, and that the difficulty of holding both things at once was not something she could solve tonight. She said, "We should sleep. Tomorrow we start fixing it." Jeffrey nodded. He looked at the table. He said her name again, the same way he had said it from the floor of the living room, with that raw quality underneath. And this time she did not stay quiet. She said, "I know, Dad. It was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning of something. A small door left slightly open, where before there had been only wall, and it was enough for that night. Enough to sleep on. Enough to start from." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the quiet flat around her, and thought about 8 months, and numbers, and narrow corridors. Outside, the city carried on. Tomorrow, they would start. 8 months sounded like a long time until it began, and then it became one of the shortest things Clara had ever lived through. She had taken a part-time job at a bakery 3 streets away, early morning shifts, starting at 5:45 and finishing before school. She had not told her friends. She had not told her teacher, who had noticed the tiredness, and asked once, carefully, whether everything was okay at home, and Clara had said yes, with a certainty that closed the subject without cruelty. She had not told Lorraine, who had her own job, her own hours, her own form of holding things together, and who Clara had decided, with a firmness that sometimes felt like love, and sometimes felt like protection, and sometimes felt like both at once, did not need this. The money she earned went into an envelope in her desk drawer. Not a bank account, an envelope. There was something important about the physical reality of it, the weight of it growing slowly, the fact that she could open the drawer and see it and count it and know it was real. She counted it every Sunday evening. Jeffrey had made changes too. He had shed one layer of the business, the speculative importing side, the part that had required borrowed money to function, and he had contracted back to what he could actually sustain on what he actually had. The office was smaller, the margins were tighter, the ambition had been trimmed to fit the space available. Clara did not know whether this was something he had chosen, or something that had been chosen for him by circumstances, and she thought it might be both, and she thought that might be how most lasting changes happen. He spoke to her differently now, not with deference exactly, more like awareness, as though he had recalibrated his understanding of what she was capable of holding and adjusted accordingly. He showed her the business ledger once, the real one, and walked her through the figures, and explained what was owed and what was coming in, and where the gap still sat. He had never done this before. He treated it as information she was entitled to, which was new, and which she accepted without comment, because commenting would have required acknowledging how different it was from before, and neither of them were ready for that conversation. Diane called every Thursday, sometimes twice. They talked about ordinary things, mostly the nursing program, a housemate who left dirty dishes in the sink for 3 days at a time, a film that was playing at the cinema near her college that she said Clara would love. And sometimes, briefly, they talked about the other thing, the real thing, not in detail but in the way of people checking on a wound together, confirming it is there, confirming it is not worse, moving carefully around the tender part. Diane said once, on a Thursday in February, that she had thought about not going back to college, that in the first days after the Monday night she had considered staying home, staying close. Clara told her she was glad she had gone. Diane said she was glad too, now, but that it had not been an easy decision. Clara said she knew, and there was a silence on the line that was not uncomfortable, the silence of two people who have understood something together that they do not need to put into more words. Lorraine noticed things. This was inevitable. Lorraine was not a woman who missed much, even if she chose not to address it. She noticed that Clara was tired in a particular way, the specific tiredness of someone carrying more than they are showing. She noticed that Jeffrey was different, quieter, more careful, in the manner of a man who has had something large removed from him, whether that something was arrogance or delusion, or simply the comfortable numbness of believing things would work out without effort. She noticed these things, and she did not ask directly, because she had lived long enough to know that asking directly is not always the fastest route to truth. She asked Clara, one Sunday afternoon in March, to help her with the shopping. They walked to the supermarket 2 streets over, and on the way back, carrying bags, Lorraine said, "I know something happened. You do not have to tell me what it was. But I want you to know that I know, and that whatever it was, we are still standing, and that is the thing that matters." Clara walked beside her mother, and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for 4 months. Something smaller and more precise, the recognition that being seen, even partially, even through a closed door, was not nothing. She said, "We are still standing." Lorraine shifted the bag in her hand and said, "That is what we do." They walked home. The city was cold and ordinary around them, and the bags were heavy, and Clara thought about what it meant that her mother, who did not know the details, who had not been in the living room, who had not heard the thing that rested on a man's knee and was picked up again and put away, that her mother had known anyway, had known in the way that mothers sometimes know things, through some channel beneath language, some read of the air in a flat, of the quality of silences at dinner, of the particular way a family holds itself together when it is holding itself together under pressure. They were still standing. That was what Lorraine had said. That was what Lorraine needed it to mean, and Clara decided to let it mean that, at least for now. The 6th month was the hardest. Jeffrey had a setback, a client who did not pay an invoice on time, a cash flow gap that threatened the schedule they had built. He came home one evening gray-faced and sat at the kitchen table and told Clara, because she was the one he told things now. The person in the flat with whom he had a kind of functional honesty he had not managed to establish before all of this. Clara looked at the numbers. She had, in the last months, become familiar with numbers in a way she had not been before. Not just the arithmetic of the envelope in her desk drawer, but the wider arithmetic of how money moved, and where it got stuck, and what the actual difference was between a permanent problem and a temporary one. She looked at the figures Jeffrey put in front of her, and she saw that it was the second kind, a gap, not a collapse. She told him so. He looked at her as though she had said something that surprised him, and then he looked at the numbers again, and saw what she was seeing, and something in his face shifted from gray to something that was not quite relief, but was at least adjacent to it. She said, "We call Owen and ask for 2 more weeks on this month's payment. We explain the situation. We offer a small additional amount next month as evidence of goodwill. Jeffrey said, "You think Victor will agree?" Clara said, "Owen will know. That is what Owen is for." Owen was contacted. Victor Crane agreed. The 2 weeks were granted. The invoice was paid, late, with an apology and a partial future fee that kept the relationship intact. The schedule resumed. Clara told none of this to anyone outside the flat. Not Katie. Not the teacher who had asked if everything was okay. She carried it in the way she was learning to carry things, not by suppressing them but by finding a structure for them, a way of holding the weight so that it was distributed evenly and did not topple her. She was not unaffected by it. She would not pretend to herself, even in her most honest moments, that carrying it had no cost. She was tired in ways that sleep did not fix. She had moments, usually in the early morning at the bakery, in the particular quiet of not quite dawn when the bread was rising and the city outside had not yet started, where the whole of it would move through her at once. The Monday night, the living room, the feel of the room, the thing on the knee, her own voice saying no, and she would stand with her hands in flour and let it move through her, and then she would go back to work. She was learning that this was how some things were held. You let them move through you at the available moments, and then you went back to work. By the 7th month they were close. Jeffrey could feel it. Clara could feel it. The envelope in her desk drawer had reached a figure she had not expected when she began, the additional shifts she had taken in the spring having compounded the savings faster than the original plan had allowed for. She told Jeffrey. He looked at the figure, and then looked at her in a way she did not know how to describe. A look that had too many things in it to separate cleanly. He said, "This was not your responsibility." She said, "I know." He said, "I should never have put any of this near you." She said, "You did not put it near me." I stepped into the room. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, you did." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, her father and her, and in that moment she was aware of all the things she had not yet decided how to feel about him, all the complexity she had been carrying in the box on the high shelf, and she was also aware that none of it was the point right now. The point was the envelope. The point was the 8 months. The point was the corridor they had found and walked down, and were almost at the end of. She said, "We pay him next month, the full remaining amount. Owen arranges the meeting. We close it." Jeffrey said, "Yes." She said, "And then we talk. Properly. You and me. There are things I have not said." Jeffrey said, "I know." She said, "But not until it is over." He said, "Agreed." She stood up. She looked at the envelope on the table between them. She thought about the Monday night, and the 8 months, and the bread in the not quite dawn, and her mother saying we are still standing, and Diane naming her daughter the thing she would eventually name her daughter, though that was still 3 years away, and Clara did not know it yet. She thought about stepping into the room, the reflex before thought, the simplest arithmetic of who was closest to the door. She thought it would not be the last time, that there would be other rooms, other doors, other moments where the math was clear, and the question was only whether you stepped forward. She was 17. She was almost 18. The city was outside, carrying on, the way it always did. She picked up the envelope and put it in the desk drawer and went to make tea. 3 years after the Monday night, Clara sat in a small office on the 4th floor of a building in the center of the city, across a desk from a woman named Helen, who ran a financial counseling charity, and applied for an entry-level position. She was 20 years old. She had finished her A-levels, not without difficulty, not without some grades that were lower than she had hoped, because she had been working the bakery shifts through the exam period, and some of the tiredness had found its way into the exam hall, no matter how carefully she had tried to leave it outside. But she had finished. And then she had taken a year of additional study, evening courses in financial administration, sitting in community college classrooms 2 nights a week after her shifts, because the knowledge she had acquired at the kitchen table with her father, and the envelope in her desk drawer was informal, and she wanted it to be formal. She wanted to understand not just the arithmetic of one family's narrow corridor, but the broader landscape of which that corridor was a part. Helen was a brisk woman in her 50s, with reading glasses on a chain, and the particular energy of someone who has been doing useful work for a long time and has no patience for anything that is not useful. She asked Clara why she wanted to work in financial counseling. Clara said, "Because I know what it feels like when the numbers stop making sense, and I want to be the person who helps someone see that they do not have to stay in that place." Helen looked at her for a moment. Then she put Clara's application form to one side and asked her to explain what she meant. Clara explained. Not everything. Not the Monday night in full. Not Victor Crane by name. Not the gun or the living room or her father on the floor. But the shape of it. A family in debt. A gap that felt like a collapse. The discovery that with the right information and the right structure, the gap was not a collapse, but a problem. And problems were things that could be addressed, if you knew how to look at them clearly. Helen listened without interrupting. Then she asked whether Clara had any experience working directly with people in financial difficulty. Clara said, "Only my own family." Helen said, "That counts." Clara got the job. She took the bus home that evening and texted Diane. "I got it." Diane called back in 40 seconds, which was a Diane thing to do, not to wait, not to delay anything that could be responded to immediately. And her laugh over the phone was the same laugh it had always been, loud and easy, the laugh that filled rooms. And Clara sat on the bus and listened to it, and felt something that was uncomplicated for the first time in a long time. She told her parents over dinner. Lorraine cried, briefly, the efficient kind of crying that contained a great deal, and released it in a short time, and then was over. Jeffrey said he was proud of her, and said it without looking at the table, which was new, which was one of the small things she had collected over the 3 years, as evidence that the change in him was real. She and Jeffrey had had the conversation, the one she had told him to wait for, back at the kitchen table in the 7th month. They had had it in stages, over the following year, in pieces that could be managed, because the conversation was not one thing, but many things, and not all of them were ready at the same time. She had told him that what he had done, the phone call, the arrangement, had broken something between them that she was not sure she could fully repair. She had told him that she needed him to understand that, not apologize for it, not explain it, but understand the scale of it. He had listened in the way he had learned to listen since the Monday night, not with the defensive stillness of a man waiting for permission to stop feeling bad, but with actual attention, the presence she had seen come into his eyes in the 7th month, and which had stayed. He had said he understood. She had believed him, not because the understanding erased the thing he had done, but because believing him was a choice she had examined from every angle and decided to make, and making it was, she found, not a reduction of what she felt but an addition to it, another thing to hold, the understanding that a person could do something unforgivable and still be someone you chose to have in your life, and that this choice was not weakness or self-deception, but its own complicated kind of strength. Diane had moved back to the city 2 years after the Monday night, having finished her nursing qualification and taken a placement at a hospital 20 minutes from the flat. She lived with 2 other nurses in a house in Fallowfield and came for dinner on Sundays. She and Clara had a way of talking that did not require the Monday night to be mentioned, because it was always present anyway. The way formative things are always present, under the surface of ordinary conversation, shaping the angle of everything without needing to be named. She named her daughter Nilufar, but that was still a year away. Victor Crane had been paid in full in the 8th month. Owen had arranged the meeting, the same neutral pub, the same arrangement, and Jeffrey had gone with the full remaining amount in an envelope that was not Clara's bakery envelope, but was partly funded by it, and he had sat across from Victor Crane and passed the envelope across the table, and Victor Crane had counted it, and then placed it in his coat pocket and extended his hand. Jeffrey had shaken it. He told Clara this part later, the handshake, and she had thought about it for a long time. The pragmatism of it, the world in which that handshake existed, and what it meant about the way some layers of the city operated, the agreements and the endings of agreements, and the formality of it. She had filed it in the complicated drawer, the one that held all the things she had encountered in the previous 8 months that did not fit into the categories she had arrived at 17 with. Her categories had expanded considerably. She worked at the charity for 2 years in the entry-level position, and then Helen promoted her. The work was not dramatic. It was spreadsheets and phone calls and appointments with people who came in looking exactly as her father had looked in the months before the Monday night. that careful management of appearance, the posture of a person trying to look like someone who does not need the kind of help they are currently asking for. She recognized it immediately and never made them account for it. She had a particular gift, Helen told her in her second-year review, for making people feel that the numbers were not in charge of them, that the numbers were information, not verdict, that information could be acted upon. Clara knew where that gift had come from. She did not say so in the review. She was 22 on the day she walked out of the office in the evening after a long shift, and stood on the pavement in front of the building, and looked at the city around her. It was November again. She had not arranged the timing. It was simply November in the way that November comes around, reliably, with its short days and its gray light, and its particular quality of air that has some cold in it but is not yet fully cold. She stood on the pavement and thought about 5 years ago. The thin wall, the 2 in the morning voice that was wrong, the way she had filed it without a label and carried it forward into 6 days of ordinary life and then into a living room doorway. She had been 17. She had said no, with a voice she was surprised to hear come out of her own body. She had made herself a variable. She had counted to 9. She was 22. She had a job that was useful. She had a mother who mowed the lawn of what she knew and did not ask for more than she was given. She had a father who looked her in the eye when he said things now. She had a sister who called back in 40 seconds. She did not think of herself as someone to whom something had happened. Or rather, she thought of herself that way, but it was not the main thing. The main thing was what she had done with it, the envelope in the drawer, the evening courses, the 7 months of being the person in the flat who could see the corridor when it looked like a wall. She pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop. The city was doing what it always did, carrying on, indifferent in the way of large things that have been operating for a long time and have accommodated many smaller things within their ongoing business. She walked. She thought about Diane's daughter, not yet born, who would be named for a flower, and who would grow up with an aunt who kept clear ledgers and always left the kitchen light on and understood, with the particular knowledge of people who have stood in certain doorways, that the most important decisions were sometimes not the ones you made, but the ones you stepped into before you had time to decide. She thought about tomorrow, the morning shift, the client coming in at 9, a man she had not met yet, whose file she had read, whose numbers she had looked at and seen the thing her father's accountant had not seen, the narrow corridor, the temporary problem that looked like permanent collapse. She would show him the corridor in the morning. That was the plan. She got on the bus. She found a seat by the window. The city moved past, lit yellow in the November dark, ordinary, and full of things happening in rooms that the street could not see. She was not afraid. She was not fearless either. She had learned, over the last 5 years, that these were not the only 2 options available, that there was a third state, the one she lived in now, where fear was present and acknowledged and simply did not have the casting vote. She looked out the bus window at the city she had grown up in, the city she had chosen to stay in, and thought of nothing in particular. The bus moved on. She rode it home.